Well, good afternoon and welcome to our May First Thursday Club. I'm Gavin Wilson, I'm a director in RSK Biocensus. So today's session is a joint effort with Rich Prue and Mark Lang, speaking about biodiversity net gain and specifically some of the questions and issues arising out of DEFRA's recent consultation on it. Mark and Rich work together in our sister company, RSK Wilding, where BNG is a keystone of the project work. Rich is a senior ecologist working with clients to explore habitat creation and enhancement opportunities within their land holding through biodiversity net gain. And Mark is a chartered ecologist who provides technical input to our environmental impact assessment and habitat regulations assessment projects, and more recently leading on our biodiversity net gain work. Rich is going to present the talk and Mark will be on hand at the end to join the Q&A session. So just before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. Microphones will be muted throughout the talk, but if you want to ask a question, then you can do that via the questions box on your screen. And we'd really encourage you to do that, as there'll be plenty of time at the end for discussion. Shortly after the end of the talk, you'll be sent a short questionnaire. And if you do have a few minutes to provide some feedback, we really appreciate it, as it helps us to shape the seminar series going forward. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rich to talk about getting our native ducks in a row. What needs to happen for biodiversity net gain to be a success? Over to you, Rich.
Thanks, Gavin, and good afternoon to everyone joining us today. The Environment Act 2021 mandated that developers must show a minimum of 10% biodiversity net gain on development, calculated using the biodiversity metric. On the 11th of January 2022, the government published a consultation on biodiversity net gain regulations and implementation, which closed last month on the 5th of April. This consultation set out the government's proposals on how biodiversity net gain could function and asked for feedback and ideas on these proposals. So over the next 30 or so minutes, we will look into this consultation and have a review of the following. Firstly, an overview of the details of this consultation, what the key issues were, what we at RSK thought, and then a few thoughts about the future. So what's the consultation all about? Now, the consultation documentation stated that biodiversity net gain needs to deliver positive outcomes for nature, improved processes for developers, a better place for local communities, and a clear process for small to large scale developments. It also indicated how biodiversity net gain will be implemented, how offsetting markets should operate, and who could regulate it. So I just want to take you through 10 things that we learned from the DEFRA consultation. Firstly, local authorities will be given some funding. The government has confirmed that it wants to provide funding for local authorities so that they can effectively implement biodiversity net gain, but that hasn't yet given how much funding that will be. As stipulated, the mitigation hierarchy is key, and this promotes on-site biodiversity uplift before off-site creation. Having said this, for some developers, this may not be practical or economically viable. A market assessment undertaken by FTEC assumes 50% of biodiversity net gain will be delivered off-site. So despite the fact that on-site will be promoted, habitat banks will be also encouraged. The government wants to incentivize the creation of habitat banks in order to develop larger scale strategic sites for nature and to smooth out the supply and demand within the biodiversity unit market. So in order to count towards a development's net gain requirement, off-site biodiversity gains will need to be secured through either a conservation covenant or a planning obligation. Off-site biodiversity units are legally required to be managed for at least 30 years and very possibly longer in some cases. So we also learned about timing. Off-site biodiversity gain will not need to be completed prior to the sale of the biodiversity net gain units. However, off-site works must commence as soon as is feasible and no more than 12 months after the BNG condition is discharged. Habitat created or enhanced after 30th of January 2020 will be eligible for the registration and sale of biodiversity units. And as we know from the metric, creating habitats in advance increases their unit worth. On the flip side, if habitats have been degraded after 30th of January 2020, the pre-degraded baseline will be used. Now, this is to stop active destruction of habitat to generate a lower baseline. The consultation introduced something called Biodiversity Gain plans. These will contain details of how a developer intends to meet BNG obligations and needs to be submitted to the local planning authority. These plans will need to be submitted and approved before the development starts. The government intends to introduce a consistent format for the game plan across all local authorities and has given an example of how this might look in the annexes of the consultation. Alongside biodiversity gain plans, something introduced called the Biodiversity Gain Site Register. Now, this will be an online, centralized, publicly available register where all off-site habitat creation projects will be registered. Registered sites will be assessed against a set of criteria to ensure that they are eligible and habitat creation proposals are achievable. It will also detail which off-site biodiversity units are allocated to which development. And it will be a legal requirement that off-site biodiversity gain sites are uploaded to this register. Also learned a bit more about pricing and brokerage. The government is intending that brokerage of off-site agreements will be left to the private market or third parties, and that the pricing of units will be agreed between buyers and sellers and regulated by the market. They will, however, offer government statutory biodiversity units, but only as a last resort. In terms of stacking, we've learned that stacking may be possible. There is an intention that land managers could be able to combine payments for biodiversity units with other payments for environmental services, for example, carbon credits or nutrient mitigation from the same parcel of land, provided they are paying for distinct additional outcomes. And lastly, monitoring and verification. Planning authorities will set specific monitoring requirements as part of planning conditions and obligations used to secure on and off-site habitat enhancement. It will be the landowner's or developer's responsibility to ensure monitoring and reporting obligations are fulfilled to the specifications of the biodiversity game plan previously mentioned. The consultation suggests that a typical schedule for a medium-sized habitat creation project might result in reports for years 2, 5, 10, 20, and 30, and it's likely this is going to be standardized. So, also of interest, potential exemptions from mandatory 10% biodiversity net gain. These are all under review, so may change. Firstly, nationally significant infrastructure projects. The consultation suggested some types of MSIPs may not be able to deliver 10% biodiversity net gain. Now, it's DEFRA's intention to apply the 10% as a minimum, but change if this is deemed necessary. Brownfield sites won't be exempt from BNG except those of low biodiversity value, those which have limited undeveloped curtilage, and those which fall below a viability threshold. Irreplaceable habitat will be exempt from biodiversity net gain and need bespoke compensation. According to the consultation, the government will set out a list of habitats considered to be irreplaceable. This list will be accompanied by short supporting guidance on what constitutes irreplaceability and bespoke compensation guidance, which will be drafted by Natural England and external stakeholders. There is also likely to be a minimum threshold for habitat areas and linear habitats, and BNG wouldn't apply to projects below this threshold. Now, this threshold has not been set yet, but would apply to the sum of all habitat types within a development site, not the size of the development site as a whole. So not include areas of hard standing, for instance, and will only apply to impacts on low or medium distinctiveness habitats. So in addition, building extension projects and self-builds are exempt, along with legally protected species, which don't factor into BNG, as it's a habitat-based metric, therefore are addressed by mitigation and licensing. So the consultation provided a lot of information as to how BNG may function. However, there are potential issues with the proposals that DEFRA set out, and these include potential resourcing shortfall. Now, many LPAs don't currently have the expertise or funding to effectively administer BNG. Glitches and inconsistencies within the biodiversity metric. Stacking of other natural capital benefits is likely to be an issue. As mentioned, it is a habitat-centric process, so species aren't currently included. A potential lack of regulation. financial challenges, the on-site versus off-site debate, i.e. where is best to offset, and finally transparency. Now, I just want to drill into these in a bit more detail. So firstly, the role of the LPAs in Natural England. The consultation proposals rely on local planning authorities and Natural England to ensure the proper functioning of BNG, including reviewing biodiversity gain plans and applications, scrutinising the metric, running the biodiversity gain sites register and future enforcement. However, although it makes some indication on additional funding, no details of this funding are given, begging the question, will either have sufficient resources to cope with biodiversity net gain? If in-house staff resources and expertise are not sufficient, will work be outsourced to consultants? And if so, as consultants, can we support the LPAs whilst having local habitat banks, or will there be a conflict of interest? Similarly, is there a conflict of interest if LPAs are also creating habitat banks? The consultation suggests that this may not be allowed to happen. However, this may change. And finally, will there be sufficient resources for monitoring and enforcement? Who will review the monitoring reports? And importantly, will enforcement be effective? So another issue is around the metric. Now, Principle 3 of the DEFRA metric states that the metric's biodiversity units are only a proxy for biodiversity and should be treated as relative values. And Principle 6 states that the metric is designed to inform decisions, not override expert opinion. There is a danger that these principles may become clouded, particularly if there is a lack of expertise on how to use the metric in consultancies, developers, and local planning authorities. This may result in a fixation on the numbers and no allowance for the diversion from the metric if deemed appropriate. In terms of inconsistencies and glitches in the metric, version 3.1 was published in April 2022 to address some of these. It includes updated guidance and definitions, as well as various updates to the formula, methodology, and condition assessments for certain habitat types. So another potential issue, as I said, is stacking. Consultation suggests that stacking would be possible and believes it would support high quality projects by incentivizing land managers to deliver a wide range of environmental benefits from a given parcel of land. But what are the implications of this decision? This could be a benefit to landowners who may not explore biodiversity net gain without the option of further payments for other services, although no guarantee that other funding would be available. However, would it result in concentrated environmental service provision on a smaller area of land? Also, can additionality be accurately shown through stacking of different services? Moving on to additionality, the consultation formally defines the additionality as a real increase in social value that would not have occurred in the absence of the intervention being appraised. And then it goes on to provide a list of situations where biodiversity net gain could fund enhancements for other requirements, and these are considered additional. It could be argued that inclusions such as funding actions of river basement management plans, which set statutory objectives for the water environment through BNG, are not additional on the basis that these actions should have already been delivered through other mechanisms. BNG in these cases should not make up for historical underfunding on this management. In addition, the inclusion of protected species mitigation areas needs more clarity. The consultation allows for the inclusion of protected species mitigation areas, but states at least 10% of the gain should be delivered through separate activities which are not required to mitigate and compensate for protected species impacts. Further clarification is needed here on whether this 10% means the entire post-development score, or whether it means 10% of the 10% gain. So, looking over the issue of how the market will work, creating biodiversity will create income. However, the market will need regulating. DEFRA states that government regulation of the biodiversity unit market will be minimal and prices will be set by market forces. Estimated price per unit was around £9,000 to £15,000 in 2019-20, but has been revised in this consultation and is now estimated at £20,000 to £25,000 per unit. However, we've seen costs up to £90,000 per unit in some cases, and it's likely that location and habitat being created will impact the price per unit. In addition, government statutory credits are proposed and will be intentionally uncompetitive, i.e. at a very high cost, and are likely to be initially available to bridge a predicted gap between biodiversity net gain going live and available off-site units on the biodiversity gain sites register. Now, these statutory credits are to be sold as a last resort after developers have demonstrated that they are unable to achieve net gain on site, off-site, or through purchasing units on the market. The habitat creation sites from government credits will be added to the biodiversity gain sites register, but unlike non-government credit sites, there would not be a link between statutory credit sites and developments buying these government credits. This raises an issue of transparency and may mean that these statutory transactions occur under less scrutiny. Also, despite minimal government intervention in the functioning of the market, regulation will undoubtedly come from the local planning authority's scrutiny of biodiversity gain plans and Natural England's running of the biodiversity gain sites register. This needs to be undertaken with a high level of expertise to ensure that proposed habitat interventions are suitable and achievable. As mentioned previously, a large amount of extra resources will be needed to ensure the proper functioning of these processes. Quality, accountability, enforcement and transparency are key, and there needs to be assurances that this will deliver for biodiversity and won't be a license to print money. Moving on to the off-site versus on-site debate. Off-site habitat creation is penalised the further away it is from development, which therefore favours on-site habitat creation. However, will on-site solutions deliver as many biodiversity benefits as landscape-scale projects? The Biodiversity Sites Register allows for transparency of off-site solutions. However, on-site habitat creation has not been included into the Biodiversity Gain Sites Register, suggesting that the provision of these on-site units will not be under the same scrutiny as off-site areas. More assurance is needed here to show that on-site habitats will create the necessary biodiversity gains that are promised. So what do we think? We think that biodiversity net gain has incredible potential to change the status quo. However, the consultation clearly lacks detail in some areas and raises questions about how biodiversity net gain will function. In particular, we think that there needs to be a level playing field that encourages private investment. The LPAs will need to act under strict rules of governance to avoid the challenges of anti-competitiveness, state aid, and conflicts of interest. We support the fact that LPAs may bring forward their own sites from which developers can purchase credit, as long as the units are intentionally high in price and developers are not directed to LPA sites in preference to others available in the market. We think that the emphasis placed on on-site delivery may have perverse outcomes, and we will welcome more flexibility, particularly in off-site large-scale habitat banks. And in terms of on-site, biodiversity gain plans must be realistic as to what is achievable with on-site biodiversity net gain. This needs sufficient resources at the local planning authority end to scrutinise biodiversity gain plans, along with sufficient expertise at the developer and consultant end to ensure that proposals are suitable, don't overpromise, and are not metric-led. We think that on-site biodiversity net gain needs to be registered using the same criteria as off-site to avoid a two-tier system. Transparency has been suggested for off-site solutions, which is great, and we think this should be applied across the board. The minimum 10% BNG requirement should be retained for all NSIPs and shouldn't be lowered. We want to see a direct alignment in requirements between NSIPs and all other development. Also, biodiversity net gain on NSIPs would be far better and more cost effective through large-scale strategic habitat banks rather than small bespoke approaches. We believe that additionality is critically important and clarification is needed to ensure biodiversity net gain does not fill the gap for historic underfunding. Also, monitoring needs to be actively feed into the management of habitats, and where notable interventions are required, that this is also reported onto the local planning authority. As stated by the user guide, the metric is a proxy and a guide. There needs to be scope for deviation with sufficient evidence, justification, and rationale based upon sufficient training and expertise. We also think that there should be an accreditation for practitioners to ensure the correct use of the biodiversity metric. And finally, and importantly, sufficiently more funding must be provided to regulators to ensure the proper functioning of biodiversity net gain. We would like more clarity on how much funding is promised and also where this funding is going. So where do we go from here? Now, the DEFRA consultation set out the bare bones of how biodiversity net gain is likely to function, albeit with some issues, as we have explored. Many points are vague and will not be clarified until the appropriate guidance is refined and published off the back of this consultation. So essentially, it's a waiting game to find out the fine detail of how all this will work. I will end, however, with a few points we have discussed within our team regarding the longer term function of biodiversity net gain. Namely, will there be enough habitat banks or offsetting sites to address the future demand for units? If not, what are the outcomes going to be? The metric is not a be-all and end-all, so will the collection of species data be encouraged and facilitated to ensure robust monitoring of future habitat condition? And finally, will the devolved nations follow suit? The Environment Act that mandated 10% biodiversity net gain was England specific. And while there are positive policies for positive effects for biodiversity across the border, will biodiversity net gain as set out here be adopted? So thank you very much for your time. Please feel free to ask any questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Rich, for a really informative overview, and there's an awful lot in there for us to think about, really. We've got a bit of time in hand, and we've got a few questions. We've got Mark back on board, so we can pick up on some of those now, and I'll work down that list. Okay, so the first one is in relation to site clearance being undertaken and the requirements for the baseline to be assessed as the habitats present prior to clearance. How can we as ecologists reduce risk of over/underestimation in our assessments? Limitations will obviously need to be clearly stated, but there's clear potential here for friction between ecologists and their clients, particularly if a precautionary approach has to be taken to habitat classification.
Rich, or do you want me to answer that one?
I guess my thoughts on it are it is a difficult one, and I think there probably will be a lot of discussions when this scenario raises its head. I guess with stuff like aerial mapping, you can see if active habitat clearance has happened by looking through historic aerial maps, and I guess it's going to have to rely on those sort of resources to develop an argument to say habitats have been cleared.
And there was something in the DEFRA consultation that the government is wise to the fact that developers might be trying to clear sites and remove the existing biodiversity value before they apply for, planning permission and that type of thing. And there's something in the metric that deals with this where, and I forget the exact sort of threshold that they've placed it on, but they are assuming that any site where vegetation is cleared after a certain period in time, they will take that as the benchmark, but anything after that, we would have to go back to the previous state when there was vegetation. So I forget the exact wording of it within the consultation. Sorry, my words are a bit confused, but there is a clause in there where the government is wise to the fact that developers might try and kind of short circuit the system by clearing sites first.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, the next one, what do you think the prospects are that habitats that are part of the net gain considerations at a development will be managed in the right way to achieve the desired net gain outcomes over time?
Shall I pick this one, Rich?
Yeah, go for it.
So I think this again is a difficult one, and I think there's going to need to be a learning curve from developers and landowners for those that are managing sites where we're looking to enhance biodiversity. And I think it's going to be a learning curve, particularly with things like grassland management, because at the moment people are geared up for regular gang mowing of sites, but if we're looking to enhance grassland where perhaps we're taking an annual hay cut, then that's going to need to lead to new equipment, new approaches, and also consideration with what we do with the arising. So what do we do with the hay that comes from that? And these are areas I think that will cause some problems going forward. I don't think we're completely geared up yet. I mean, there are plenty of organisations out there with experience of habitat management and site management, but your general kind of management company, I think, will need to be quite a lot of upskilling, I think. So I'm reasonably confident, but I do think there's a skills gap and a learning curve that's going to be required.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to adaptive management, and also the timescales we're talking about. 30 years is quite a long time. So what may have been proposed with previous developments, proposed for 30 years, things are going to be at a longer timescale. So a lot of it is going to rely on the accuracy of monitoring, which should be scrutinised by the local planning authority according to the consultation, but also the ability to adapt the management based on the monitoring and how habitats are progressing over those 30 years.
Okay, great, thank you. So the next one is, does the consultation state that a single metric, presumably the DEFRA one, must be used to ensure that all units calculated across the country have the same value in habitat terms? If not, is there not a risk that rival metrics may under or overvalue units?
So yeah, the DEFRA metric is the one that is going to be used. The only alternative to that is what's called the small sites metric, which is, I think, currently in beta testing, which is for developments under 0.25 of a hectare and only those of low or medium distinctiveness habitats. But it is all using the DEFRA metric, so there's no rival metrics which can be used.
Okay, exactly. But actually, oh, sorry, Mark, go on.
For exactly the reasons as the questioner outlined.
Actually, that relates to another question, which is, how does the small site metric fit into this? What differences are there in terms of monitoring and management requirements?
So it simplifies the DEFRA metric, and it's still under the same requirements, still under 30 years. The differences being that small sites metric is likely to be delayed by 12 months before it started to be used widely. I guess on the reason that they want to make sure that the metric is functioning and everything is functioning as it should be before they add in an extra element. But in terms of its functioning, it's a simplified metric for low, medium distinctiveness habitats at small scale, but it still works in the same way as the DEFRA metric in the same timescales.
Okay, great. Okay, so the next one is, are you optimistic that there will be sufficient funding for local authorities to oversee and manage the process?
No. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. As they've said, funding will be given, but it needs to be a lot of funding. You know, this is a huge amount of administrative work and needs a certain amount of expertise in local councils in natural England, and they need to start doing that now, because although the Environment Act has come in, BNG doesn't necessarily kickstart until secondary legislation is passed, which is proposed to be next year. So we need to see funding now ahead of the game to ensure everything is going to work.
I think what we might see is what we've begun to see already, that where some local authorities are slightly ahead of the curve, they are adding the cost that they might need to implement and develop the requirements for biodiversity net gain into the amount that they're charging if they're offering units, and certainly some of the local authorities that were further advanced and were acting for the DEFRA pilot. So Warwickshire, for example, now have a pretty good team of in-house ecologists, and the majority of that money to fund that has come through the biodiversity net gain process. So although government funding will be limited, if the process works as it should do, I would think that some of that private sector funding will begin to fund some of the requirements and duties that local authorities have been asked to deliver.
That is true. And then I guess the last thing to add to that is stuff like the Biodiversity Gain Sites Register. there is likely to be a fee to put your off-site area on it, and that fee would therefore pay for some of the administration of the Biodiversity Gain Sites Register.
Yeah, correct. But I'm still hesitant that there'll be sufficient funding from government, particularly the existing government.
So there's a question relating to that actually. Do you think enforcement is likely to happen in reality, given the problems that we already see enforcing planning conditions currently?
Well, my current
challenge.
Yeah, my current view is, given the problems we're seeing with enforcement already, unless there's a radical change to the number of enforcement officers that local authorities employ, and that the budget is there to employ them, I can foresee the same problems that we're having with protected species and enforcement of planning conditions and things. So, and developers are wise to this, I think, because we all have examples, I'm sure, of where things haven't happened and nobody's taken the enforcement action. But it's early days, we just have to wait and see.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving down the list. So do you have a view on how or whether the BNG metric and approach could be adapted in future to help us deliver mitigation, enhancements and compensation for particular species?
One for you, Rich, first, I think. It's a difficult one, being habitat based, and to answer that, I don't know as of yet. I think in terms of how I see protected species or just species coming in is including them in the monitoring of sites to better build up a picture of habitat condition. But in terms of how to build those into the front end of the metric, I'm not too sure as of yet.
There was some discussion in the consultation that where for legally protected species we might have some habitat enhancement or habitat creation mitigation. So, for example, new scrub planting for dormice or creation of rough grassland for reptiles and great crested newts, then perhaps that element of habitat creation could be added into the metrics, that we're kind of killing two birds with one stone. So we're getting some habitat enhancement biodiversity points, and we're also delivering some of our protected species mitigation, and we see no reason why habitat creation and enhancement that's required for protected species can't be accounted for as part of the metric, but other species mitigation measures like destructive searching, putting up bat and bird boxes and things like whatever mitigation we might do for bats, that type of thing is slightly harder to add in because the metric is habitat based. It's designed to try and keep it simple, and there's a clear distinction in the consultation that government is expecting the normal route for dealing with legally protected species through kind of licensing, consultation and mitigation arising out of that to continue as it has, if that helps.
Yeah. And as a thought, maybe you could build in an additional metric into the biodiversity metric around presence of protected species within a given habitat, which would necessarily improve the biodiversity units that you're talking about.
I think part of the problem is that when we start introducing species into the metric calculations, we end up with something quite complicated, and they're trying to make the metric as simple as possible so that it's easy to understand and easy to administer. So there is a danger that if we go too far down the protected species route, that things get horribly complicated, and then how do we value a site and how do we calculate biodiversity units? So that the beauty of the metric at the moment is that it is a relatively simple, easy to use process, albeit just a proxy for biodiversity value, and that value doesn't necessarily take account of species value. So there are critics of the metric, and I understand why, but I think we also need to look at it from the opposing point of view, that unless we have something that's simple to operate and easy to use, if it's complicated and hideously difficult, nobody's going to bother and we're not going to progress.
So there's a follow-on comment about that, saying, could you not weigh the metric in some circumstances so that habitats of particular value to protected species have a higher value and so are prioritised?
I guess you could. I guess that is partially captured within distinctiveness and condition already, arguably. But I don't know, Mark. What do you think?
I don't know. I think there's a value in overvaluing habitat where we have legally protected species. For example, if you have ancient woodland, but ancient woodland has a pond in it that supports great crested newts, does that mean you value it higher than bog standard ancient woodland with no crested newts in it? And also, some protected species use habitats of relatively low distinctiveness. So reptiles might use an area of rough grassland that has no botanical value. So does that then increase the biodiversity value of that habitat? And there's also an element that could suggest, I don't know, you've got a flower-rich meadow, but if you leave it to become derelict and don't manage it, it will become more suitable for reptiles. Then is it higher than the habitat you started with in the first place? I think trying to put a value on habitat for their value to legally protected species is not without its difficulties.
And I guess, I mean, that's the whole point of the metric being an addition as opposed to the be all and end all. You would sort of as a whole look at the picture as a whole and not just focus on the metric. So you would be bringing in those protected species elements anyway.
Yeah, and I guess we're already fairly used to dealing with legally protected species in terms of statutory EIA and HRA and through the normal kind of assessment process, and perhaps that's the way that it's best delivered rather than trying to simplify everything to a kind of metric. But I do take the questioner's point.
Okay, great, thank you. The next one is there an intention to integrate off-site BNG into local nature recovery networks?
You would hope so. The consultation hasn't said much about that, but there will be focus in those sort of areas. There's something called the spatial risk multiplier or spatial risk category when you're looking at off-site solutions, which kind of minus your biodiversity units the further away you are from a development. And that's kind of at the moment the spatial risk categories are categorized within a local planning authority or within a natural character area. Then you wouldn't necessarily lose any points. I reckon that's where these local nature recovery strategy is going to be implemented. So if your offsite area is within a local nature recovery strategy, then potentially there is going to be less, there's not going to be as much penalisation as if it was outside of that local nature recovery strategy.
There was an element in, I mean, I haven't yet looked at version 3.1, but there was an element in version 3 of the metric where it gave a strategic significance value to habitat on the basis that if your habitat creation or your baseline habitat was within an area of strategic significance, like for example a local recovery network zone, then it scored slightly higher than habitat outside of that. So I don't know whether that's been replicated within version 3.1, but that was an early trial at trying to take account of prioritizing areas for where you might offset habitat.
Yeah, it has been taken forward to 3.1, and and that's, I guess you're absolutely right. It would be a way to note that your baseline habitats may or may not be in a local nature recovery strategy, and additionally you're offsite. So another multiplier as well.
But we would also hope that there could be a sort of coordinated and strategic approach to biodiversity net gain, and certainly one of the aspects that we've been exploring with some large utility companies, where they're doing multiple small-scale works in a region, it would kind of make sense if that sort of biodiversity net gain could be delivered on a kind of more strategic approach, so delivering something bigger within a region, say, rather than little tiny bits all over the place where multiple small-scale development is having a minor effect. But if we could add it together and do it on a more sort of strategic level, and then obviously if we can partner with where Natural England have identified their recovery zones, then perhaps we can do something a bit more strategic and a bit more significant. So there is some indication in the metric that might be possible, but it's slightly complicated because there is this presumption that you want to deliver biodiversity net gain as close to the source of impact as possible. So in a sense, the metric discourages you from doing that by penalising you slightly. But this, I think, is just the case that Rich made, where the metric is just a tool and we shouldn't be slave to it. And if we can come up with something that's strategic and robust and sensible, then that's a discussion to have with the local authority, particularly for large scale NSEC projects, I think, as well as, you know, we should be pushing this strategic approach, really, particularly in line with the Lawson review, the kind of bigger, better and more joined up, really.
Yeah, great, thank you. Still questions popping in, and we've got a little bit of time left, so I'll pick up the next one. What consideration has been given to the baseline biodiversity value of sites increasing or decreasing over time without intervention? So e.g. young woodland or open mosaic habitat. Will you always have to use the current state of the site as a baseline, or might it make sense to sometimes use the likely state of the site in, say, 25 years without development?
Good question.
What do you think, Mark?
I don't actually have an answer to this. I think from what I remember of the consultation, you have to take the baseline as you find it when you're undertaking your calculation. And I take the point about things like open mosaic, because the quality of that can decrease in time as the succession increases. Your kind of early successional habitat can decrease. So I think if you have a site that's got biodiversity value, but you're not actually developing it for 20 to 30 years, then you would have to take the biodiversity at the time that you do the calculation, because otherwise there's a danger of underestimating the biodiversity value of a site, but also conversely overestimating, I think. So I think it's taking it at the point where you're looking to develop a site and taking it forward from that point, because otherwise, as the questionnaire indicated, you know, you might undervalue the biodiversity value with young woodland because it's going to be more important in time, whereas with open mosaic you might overvalue slightly down the line. So I think it's taking it from the baseline when development is likely to occur, really. And
I imagine that you would have to, if you took the baseline now, you would have to repeat it anyway. If you know, 10 years was going to pass before impact is going to happen. And I guess areas like that kind of indicate also where, if you can avoid those areas and they have a potential increase in value in the future, then there are areas where you can look for enhancements and biodiversity units on site.
And I think this would also form part of where people are interested in creating habitat banks to use to sell the biodiversity credits at a later point in time. Then the consultation is suggesting that if you're doing that in advance, you should be able to claim for any kind of enhancement that you've done to increase the number of biodiversity units that the habitat on your site supports. So I think it is recognised, and certainly we've been involved in a number of locations recently where we've updated a biodiversity net gain calculation that was done, say, 3 or 4 years ago, and there has been a marked decline in the quality of habitat because of scrub encroachment or vegetation removal, whatever it might be. And there what we've done is just shown how the habitat value has decreased over time and how the distinctiveness and condition has been reflected in the metric calculation. And then having that narrative and having that discussion with the local authority has been quite helpful, because we're taking because whenever you do your net gain calculation, it's purely a snapshot, but obviously we're taking the most up-to-date snapshot as the most relevant.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we are out of time. There's 1 or 2 questions that we didn't quite get to, and we'll do our best to follow those up and answer them after this. Just to say thanks very much again, Rich and Mark, and to everyone who's attended. Again, if you've got a moment to fill out the questionnaire, we would much appreciate it. Finally, just to say that the next First Thursday Club is on the 2nd of June, and the topic is Sustainability Challenges in the Rail Industry, and that's going to be given by Ross O'Donovan. And on that note, we wish you all a good day and hope you'll join us next time. Goodbye.
Thank you.